Now, Sudan, you can give the war there almost every superlative going. It's now the world's greatest displacement crisis. It's the greatest hunger crisis. It's the greatest humanitarian crisis. So, what's being done to stop this immeasurable amount of suffering? A question for the Sudanese political economist, JAWHARA KANU. JAWHARA, thank you very much for joining us. Now, this war's been grinding on for 18 months now. Many attempts at talks, at dialogue have started, but no one has managed to stop the fighting. Why have so many attempts at dialogue failed?
Thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk about what's happening in Sudan. As you rightly mentioned, 18 months into the crisis, we don't see much advancement in terms of dialogue, negotiation, or even um, serious international attention that would eventually lead to any solution. At the same time, what we see unfolding every day is a massive humanitarian crisis that's being projected in different fronts. In terms of displacement, in terms of food insecurity, in terms of access to education, health service, and basic needs for the people of Sudan. I think you've asked about the dialogue and a solution not being reached. I think there are different layers to be unpacked here. Of course, solutions can be Sudanese owned and they can be supported internationally. In terms of the Sudanese owned solutions, Sudan's problems haven't started on the night of April 14th. We've had some political stagnation for a few years. We had one of the longest standing dictatorships in Africa. Which was moved forcefully by a peaceful revolution. And then after that, the transitional period was not the easiest, leading to all this political turmoil in the country, making it difficult for the political elite to broker a deal that would bring some peace to the country at the moment. At the same time, internationally, unfortunately, the Sudanese crisis have been not always getting the attention it needs, depending on what other crisis is taking place in the world, depending on priorities of the countries trying to intervene in the crisis, and depending on the positionalities of the different parties in the war itself. Because even though the war is being fought on the ground between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces, the leading warring parties, there is a huge international alignment of countries behind the two warring parties. Of course, depending on incentives, depending on the power structures, and depending on these countries' long-term plans for Sudan. So it's complicated to look at it if you look at it from the local level, the political kind of arena, and if you even look at it from the international community. Same thing goes for multilateral institutions. Of course, Sudan is part of the IGAD community, the intergovernmental community, which is like our regional bloc in the African Union. We're also part of the African Union, though our membership has been suspended since the coup in 2021. Um, and there is the United Nations. These agencies, of course, interact differently. Some of them have like humanitarian arms. Some of them have um, rather arms that try to broker peace and so on. But so far, even these have been somewhat coupled for different reasons, because these are government entities. At the end of the day, the UN is composed of countries. Same thing goes for the African Union. Same thing goes for the IGAD. So it's not easy to come up with a solution that unifies all these people together.
Jawara, so I mean, you've outlined a sort of a panoply of players in the Sudan crisis. Where do the levers of leverage actually lie? Who has the power to do something about it?
I think if I may say, unfortunately, there isn't a magical wand or a magical solution that can fix the issue of Sudan at the moment. It can be all these different layers, because I for one, am a believer that whatever solution would have to be generated by the Sudanese broader society, represented by its political parties, by the civil society, by the different forms of representation that are there. That has to be in place. A proper political process has to be in place. And there is also an international role to be played for protecting civilians, for making sure that humanitarian aid is being channeled through, and all these kind of things. And for the regional players to align their incentives or their priorities same as the people of Sudan. So unfortunately, I don't have a simple answer. I wish I had a particular lever where we would just work with, but I think it would just have to be multi-sectorial, multi-layered.
Jawara, do you feel that the African countries, other African countries, particularly the neighboring countries, but other African countries, Nigeria, etc., do you feel they're sufficiently interested in the crisis that the Sudan is going through at the moment?
The direct answer would be no. Immediate neighbors of Sudan, yes, they're interested for different reasons because they're positively and negatively affected, more negatively with the conflict in Sudan. So, going back to the issue of displacement, for example, more than 300 million people have crossed the borders from Sudan to its neighboring countries. So, this automatically puts Egypt, Chad, Libya, Ethiopia, South Sudan at a huge vulnerability of receiving big amounts of refugees.
Jawara, I'm not talking about people who are negatively affected and therefore interested because for for self-interested reasons. Because obviously, if you've got a whole bunch of refugees and displaced people on your doorstep, you're going to be concerned. I'm talking about genuine concern on a humanitarian level.
As I said, the direct answer would be no. The direct answer would be no, especially from countries that don't share borders with Sudan.
And so, do you find that maybe there's very little interest internationally in Europe or the States or whatever? Do you feel that there's more interest internationally than regionally or continentally, or it
I
doesn't
think
matter? Just
there is more interest regionally and internationally, but it's not necessarily for the humanitarian reasons as you mentioned earlier before. There is interest because these different countries, these different groups have alignments that require them to intervene at the moment in a certain way. So, for example, different countries in the Arab states, or different countries in the West, or even in Europe, they have interest. Like Europe, for example, is having interest in controlling migration. So they might have an interest in intervening in this crisis, not because there is a humanitarian crisis and this should be a priority. So it would depend on which actor, but there are different interests being played out.
Yeah, Joara, thanks for this. You mentioned some sort of intervention to get humanitarian, medical, and food aid to people. And there was big international debate after all these UN reports talking about the depth of the crisis, 15 million people at risk of serious food shortages, maybe a million people dying of famine. This would be happening in front of everyone's eyes with all our knowledge, and yet it's still happening in 2024. And what, 3 decades after the genocide in Rwanda, yet the UN Security Council met last week and couldn't agree on any intervention to deal with this. What's your take on this, and what can be done to get the right sort of intervention to save lives, but not to complicate the political process? How do you see the way out?
I think the right way to put it is for people to put this humanitarian angle at the front line ahead of everything else. So, for example, we're still having a debate of who should be representing what at talks, but the humanitarian aspect is not being prioritized in the same way. That's the first element of it. The second element would be the resources needed for this humanitarian action. It's not little, but it also, whatever that's being committed to is not being provided. For example, we have had different international gatherings where international players, be it countries or even organizations, pledging to pay certain amounts of money for the ongoing crisis, even at earlier stages, but that amounts of money haven't been fully deployed yet. I remember some of the statistics from August this year that only 37% of what's being pledged is actually being paid out by the different donor countries or by the different organizations and so on. So there is the issue of financing. There is also the issue of access, because at the end of the day, for this humanitarian support to access the people inside the country in a war situation, there has to be ways how it's being delivered, be it material kind of humanitarian support. And that's not very easy because we're having areas whereby the two forces are having different control areas. So it's not easy to have a unified way of channeling down aid from one place, like from the port city to inside the country. So there is a lot of negotiation that has to happen there. And unfortunately, this negotiation is highly political. So even if you try and disjoint the humanitarian from the political, you would end up there. And same thing goes for the other borders of the country from neighboring countries. There is lots of political negotiations happening. The third thing, which is also important, is that in theory, Sudan has lots of resources. For years, the people of Sudan have depended on agriculture, on their own crops, and so on. And this hasn't been very easy for people to sustain this year. And even the year before. First of all, of course, lack of security. People are not able to access their farms. They're not able to access production inputs. And when they do, they're not able to harvest safely. Hence, there is this issue of the fact that even the resources that are available within the country, people are not able to fully utilize them. Some parts of the country have successfully managed to harvest, but it remains an issue that how can you access markets and how can you exchange goods from one place to another. So even if you try and say, okay, let's prioritize the humanitarian crisis, you cannot take it out of the other dynamics that are taking place in reality.
And what I find particularly depressing about this is that both sides, well, it started, didn't it, with a war between two generals, but it's now expanded to include a whole variety of armed groups and even vigilantes, those people taking up arms in order to protect themselves and their communities. So it's now countrywide and involving so many different axes of conflict.
That's true. That's absolutely true. Because, as I said, it didn't just start in the 15th of April. Before that, Sudan had different armed movements that were either in agreement with the government through certain peace agreements, or some of them were not even in agreement with the government at the time. But what that tells you is that there's always been a tendency for certain parts to be armed within the existing kind of structure of the state. This is, of course, a legacy that has been passed down since the war in the south, since the war in Darfur, and since the previous government have been arming different tribal groups in order to um, uh, to serve the government purposes in certain areas. So there've always been this tendency for groups to be armed either by the state or by their own resources. There is that element. And now there is the basic need for one to protect themselves. I mean, when we see the attacks that are being raged on the villages, the atrocities, the rapes and everything, it's only natural for humans to want to protect themselves, even though it's very imbalanced kind of battle, whereby um, the troops would be highly equipped, they would be highly trained, and the citizens, they're having their simple arms trying to defend themselves and so on. But you're right, it's now not just the RSF and the Sudanese armed forces. There are different streams, be it like new armed movements being trained in Sudan and outside of Sudan, be it older armed movements positioning themselves as one of the warring parties, or be it regular citizens finding an opportunity in a blooming arms market, buying guns, buying equipments to protect themselves, and then taking it upon themselves, which is even jeopardizing them further.
So, Joara, is there any hope? If you could choose one thing that would move things forward out of this crisis zone, what would you suggest?
I would say it should be the focus on the protection of civilians and the focus on the humanitarian aspects, because despite it being very complicated at the moment, it's the most pressing need, number one, and it's the area where there can be some consensus made to some extent.
I mean, I've heard people argue the case for safe havens of the sort that we saw in the Yugoslav civil war in the 1990s, where, you know, everyone understands how fierce the fighting is and how determined the two sides are. But if the international system set up some sort of safe havens for civilians to gather, to collect food and medical supplies, might that be some sort of help?
That's definitely one of the solutions that people have been debating over the past few days, highly rather. Some people look at it as a solution. Some people look at it as an issue that would it depends on what side, of course, you're supporting, but some people look at it as an issue that's going to highly affect the sovereignty of the state represented by the army and so on. However, I think what's important is that yes, there is an experiment there, there is experiences there where people can learn from, but there is also the Sudanese legacy. And it's important for people to focus on that. Since the beginning of the war, for example, Darfur region has 5 states. 4 of these 5 states have managed to broker local peace deals between the warring parties in the areas. It's true that some of them didn't hold for long. It's true that there were different contexts at play at the time, but this tells you that the community itself is able to generate ideas. So my take would be, if we are going to adapt this solution of safe havens, green zones, localized ceasefires, whatever is the term that we're using, it shouldn't be a solution that's blueprinted by the international community and implemented on the ground. It has to borrow from the legacies even within the current war, and even from the initial incidences that have been taking place across the country. And this is just an example. There have been smaller villages that have been doing this. There have been towns. There have been areas where people have been negotiating travel routes. So I think this is what needs to be included. Of course, it's hard work because, number one, Sudan is a very big country. You can't have one solution that can be replicated in different areas. But I think at least since it's owned by the community would be working harder to at least sustain it for a longer period. So this is how I see it.
JAWHARA KANU, thank you very much indeed. It's not a very pretty picture that you're painting, but you've illuminated some of the grave issues for us. So JAWHARA, thank you so much indeed.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.